Something interesting is happening with Yoshimitsu. For the first time, I think ever, people are considering him top tier and professional players are considering picking him up to use in tournament. So here I wanted to share my thoughts on the current situation and the current state of the character in Tekken 8. First, let's talk about why this is such a big deal for Yoshi players. Yoshimitsu has always been considered a gimmicky, knowledge check, scrub killer character that required a high amount of investment to learn his deep move pool. Throughout Tekken 7, Yoshimitsu has always hovered around the bottom 10 characters in terms of usage, so it was very hard to gain that match of knowledge against him. So you would think that, like those other gimmicky knowledge check characters, Athena, Bears, that they would have a high win rate because of people that don't understand the matchup. But this wasn't really the case for Yoshimitsu either. He was consistently also bottom 3 in terms of win rate. Now obviously, win rate does not equate to a character's competitive strength. Right next to Yoshimitsu, the bottom win rate was Jin, who consistently placed well in tournaments. I bring this up to highlight the community's exposure and familiarity with the character in online play. Even if you didn't know the matchup, by his win rate, he just didn't seem to be that threatening for most people. In the competitive sense, I recall most pro players ranking him around B or C tier. And so it was this B tier, most losing, unpopular Yoshimitsu that was also on paper the strongest Yoshimitsu we've had since Tekken 5 DR. Now the data in Tekken 8 tells a very different story. Yoshimitsu is now one of the most popular characters in the top third of character popularity, and his win rate is, well, still on a lower side, I'd say in a lower third, but still pretty reasonable. I think there's a bit of an inverse relationship between popularity and win rate, at least for online, and Yoshimitsu seems to be a lot more balanced than it was in Tekken 8, or Tekken 7 rather, where it seemed to be a bit underpowered or underrepresented. Something that I think is worth noting for sure is that this user, not quite factual, on Reddit, they separated the data for Fujin to Tekken God ranks and also Tekken God ranks by themselves, and we could see at these higher ranks, Yoshi has increasing representation but decreasing win rates. So comparatively speaking, everyone's playing Yoshimitsu and he's actually not flailing like he was in previous games. So let's touch on why that is. As I said before, Yoshimitsu has always been a more gimmicky, specialist character, but since Tekken 6 they've been slowly streamlining the character, and that trend continues in Tekken 8. They did this by removing or nerfing many of his unblockables, but in his place gave him very solid neutral and mix-up options, which are legitimately viable. They've also put a ton of power into his no sword stance, while simultaneously making it less punishing to use. Before, no sword stance was more of a conventional version of Yoshimitsu, where he didn't have a lot of his stance mix-ups or a lot of his range and unblockables, but in his place had a stronger flash hitbox, and he was able to fare better in certain matchups that you would pull out every once in a while. But now in Tekken 8, no sword stance is a lot more integral to his game plan because he has a lot more attacks which allow him to transition to or transition out of no sword stance. On top of that, the key attacks in no sword stance that brought out his sword, like Flash, were given healing properties. Before, to heal with Yoshimitsu, you needed to use meditation cancels, Indian sit, all these things to kind of bait your opponent to coming into you, but now the healing is integral to some of the most powerful attacks from the stance. So while no sword stance is still restrictive in some ways, such as range and unblockables, the healing and the flash range more than makes up for it, and since it's the more conventional way to play, a lot more people that are not used to playing Yoshimitsu style Yoshimitsu are going to have a lot better time using the character. So what happens now? Is Yoshimitsu top tier? Is he broken? Are Arslan and PhiDX and all these pro players going to pick up Yoshimitsu and start smacking everybody in tournaments? Let me know what you think and let's have a discussion. For me, I think it's both a yes and a no, and I apologize for what sounds like a non-committal answer, but I'm going to try to explain. Imagine you are a chef, and in your knife block you have an array of knives that are your character's tools. Some are better than others. You have your serrated knife, pared knife, chef's knives, all these knives, but at the end of the day, they're still knives that you can use, and you're good with the knife. Playing Yoshimitsu is like only having one chef knife, but having a mandolin, a corn shredder, a slap chop, and one of those things that make your vegetables turn into spirals. Each of these gadgets are not hard to use, but they are for very specific purposes, and the challenge when playing Yoshimitsu is knowing when to bust each of them out. They take up a lot of space in the cupboard that is your mind, and that's why Yoshimitsu has such a large move pool. That's why Yoshimitsu players sometimes do these dumbass plays. You gotta use these tools. If you don't, of course you still have the option of using that one chef's knife. You're arguing with knives after all. But if you're only using the chef's knife, then why not use the character that gives you the full knife block? You know what I'm saying? I think there's a misconception that Yoshimitsu has both the full knife block set and all of these gadgets. But Yoshimitsu does have some real weaknesses in both his actual moveset and his game plan. In contrast with his ability to use spins, Yoshimitsu's movement otherwise is pretty subpar, his sidestep being among the worst in the game next to the big characters. Many of his attacks don't have great tracking, and his lows aren't really anything to write home about either. Unblockable sword sweep helps greatly in that department, up until you find people that actually react and can punish it. And until you get around 15 frames, Yoshimitsu's while standing punishers are not that great either. We can talk about specifics in the comments, but what I'm saying is that these shortcomings kind of funnel the Yoshimitsu players to use a lot of his Yoshi tools like flash and spins and unblockables. What Yoshi does with these tools is that he forces both players to use mental frames, which is something that a lot of the lower level players have a hard time dealing with, especially in such an aggressive game like Tekken 8. He destroys people that play predictably or who have not yet realized that you don't have to take your frame advantage. He also destroys people that have not trained themselves to react to some of his slower, powerful moves. In this way, this is why Yoshimitsu is a scrub killer. For advanced and pro players though, changing up your timing and attack choices is something that's intrinsic to the game, and this doesn't necessarily give Yoshimitsu an advantage, but allows his game plan to work in the first place. For this reason, it can be difficult for Yoshimitsu to open up defensive players who understand the matchup, and for him to come back from a life deficit. When that happens, Yoshimitsu needs to start playing more risky, and a lot of times it doesn't work out. So without knowing all the specific interactions, I would think that the worst matchup for Yoshimitsu are the characters that don't need to commit or overextend their offense, like say Elisa, Claudio, or Fang. I'm no pro player, so feel free to correct me or provide your input, but I think what's way more important than which character you use is knowing how to play against Yoshimitsu, which is not easy. Because after you learn the matchup, after you even know all the gimmicks, you'll still need to be comfortable playing in a way that will bait the Yoshimitsu to commit to his moves, flash, sword sweep, spins, whatever, and while at the same time not overextending yourself to get baited by those moves themselves. So for those that are not familiar with the character, I hope I'm illustrating why it's challenging to go against Yoshimitsu and also why it's challenging to play as Yoshimitsu. That said, just because he has challenges and weaknesses does not mean that he cannot be overpowered or overtuned or top tier. Again, I'm not the most qualified person to talk about Yoshimitsu's relative strength, but I can at least share my opinion on different parts of his kit. First, I'm generally against big dumb moves on Yoshimitsu. Think in Season 4 of Tekken 7 where they gave him that counter hit launch from his forward 1+2. In a similar way, the counter hit of the second hit of 1-1 in his no sword stance is extremely powerful. Unless Yoshimitsu's in heat, it's not a constant threat since you get pulled out of no sword stance after using it, even on block, but it just seems a little uncharacteristic to have such a move explode the opponent after challenging a one jab. I also think there's merit to the notion that Yoshimitsu doesn't take enough health away when he does his backspins, specifically because his health regen is so much more consistent now that it's part of his combos rather than his stances. But other than that, I think Yoshi's mostly fine, and by fine I mean he's not broken. Does he have great damage? Absolutely, as does almost everyone in Tekken 8. And I don't subscribe to the idea that Yoshimitsu must have low damage because he's an unorthodox character. To the contrary, I think it's actually fantastic that Yoshimitsu is strong enough to be considered viable in the competitive meta. Fantastic down forward 2, great neutral tools and small Tekken tools, down 2 and standing 3 strings, and very threatening options from his stances. He has a lot going for him this time around. I'd like to see more characters like Yoshi, Steve, Brian, Raven that show the different aspects of Tekken besides who has the best buttons. As of now in 1.5, I think Yoshimitsu is top tier if the Yoshi is able to make reads on his opponent, and drops down if the opponent's able to make reads on Yoshi. I think he drops down even further as time passes and players improve to capitalize on his weaknesses. Finally, let's talk about two of the biggest new Yoshimitsu mains, Arslan and PhiDX. As two of the most high profile names in the Tekken scene, I'm really interested in where each of them take the character, and if they'll be sticking with him long term. Arslan has Yoshimitsu in his top 5 and he pledges to use him after EVO. His reasoning for placing Yoshi there makes me raise an eyebrow though. He mentioned that Kaden Trench's style of Yoshimitsu reminded him of playing Kuni using a simple style with effective use of mix-up and 50-50s. But as the best Yoshimitsu player in the world, Kane makes Yoshi look actually broken, and Yoshi is not like Kunimitsu at all, at least in how they apply their mix-ups. Kuni has quicker attacks that can build a constant stream of pressure that the opponent has to react to, whereas Yoshi is a little bit slower and more committal and has the opponent guessing on if he's going to pull a trigger or not. And unlike Kuni, Yoshi is far less effective at creating opportunities using movement outside of his backspins. But listen, I'm not about to sit here and say that Arslan Ash can't figure out Yoshimitsu and have some success with him just because he doesn't have the same strengths as some of the other characters he gravitates towards. But I do think that even if he sticks with Yoshimitsu long term, it's not going to be a character that he goes to first, but rather someone that he pulls out every now and again on certain matchups or for certain players. PhiDX though might be a different story. I think there's a better chance of him becoming an actual Yoshimitsu main given that he played Noctis in Tekken 7, so he's used to using fundamentals followed by a bunch of fucking bullshit. But for real, I think his position as a content creator gives him a lot more leeway to live or die by the Yoshimitsu. After all, Yoshimitsu is the most entertaining character to watch in my totally unbiased opinion. So yeah, that's my take on the current state of Yoshimitsu. I think the dude is super strong, but I also think the baseline of strength in Tekken 8 is just super crazy in general. But let me know what you think. And yeah, looking forward to seeing more Yoshi.